Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Joan Brzezinski, and I direct the University of Minnesota China Center. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to the University of Minnesota China Center's Considering China webinar series with Professor Mark Sidel. Thank you for your support of the China Center and the Considering China webinar series, and I offer our special thanks to Kai Mei, Terry, and Joseph Terry for their generous support of this program. This is the first time we've ever offered this program hybrid, so we are excited to have an in-person audience as well as those of you online. The questions will be handled at the end of the program through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So please submit those anytime during the program, and we'll answer as many questions as we can at the end. For those of you in the room, you'll just have to raise your hands. I'd like to welcome Professor Mark Sidel, who is the Doyle-Bascom Professor of Law and Public Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and elected member of the American Law Institute. He serves on the boards of the International Center for Non-for-Profit Law and the China Medical Board, the Rights Practice in the US, and other organizations. Professor Sidel has also research affiliations with the University of Liverpool School of Law, Social Justice, the Center for Social Impact and Philanthropy in New Delhi, the US Asia Law Institute, and at NYU Law School, and the Center for Nonprofit Strategy and Management at the City University of New York, Baruch College. I may pronounce that wrong. The University of Western Australia Law School, and the Paul Berwald School of Social Work and Social Welfare at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Professor Sidel has frequently served and is frequently cited as an appointed expert for British firms and courts in human trafficking cases involving Vietnam, China, and the Philippines. He has also consulted with the US State Department on human trafficking and labor law issues. Professor Sidel's research and writing focus on the nonprofit sector and philanthropy, with a focus on Asia and the US, modern successionary movements, and constitutional law in China and Vietnam. He has an extensive experience in international philanthropic and funding communities. He served on the Ford Foundation team that established the foundation's office in China, and as the foundation's first program officer for law, legal reform, and nonprofit organizations based in China, Beijing, in the late 1980s. In the early and mid-1990s, he developed and managed the Ford Foundation's programs in Vietnam. In addition to the scholarly policy articles that he has written, he is also author of 11 books, with a forthcoming book on Xi Jinping's China and international nonprofit community with the book Brookings Institution Press. It's due out in 2025. Professor Sidel first joined the China Center for a program in 2016, reflecting on Henry Kissinger's discussion of China. After nearly 10 years, we are so pleased to welcome you back to the University of Minnesota. Please welcome Professor Mark Sidel. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan. Thank you, Haiyan. I'm delighted to be back here and to say a few words about some of what's going on in China today, at least from my perspective, and then to answer any questions, have any discussion, either with people who are here or people who are online. I do have a handout, which I think is going to go maybe in the chat box, maybe up on the screen, but that will be available to everyone. I was recently in China with an American foundation exploring what's possible to do in China after COVID and about, 12 years into the Xi Jinping era in China. And I was struck, as I have been ever since the late 1980s, at the expansion of social control mechanisms in China of various kinds. This goes back a long ways. That's not to say there were not social control mechanisms in China before 1989, before Tiananmen, but they expanded consistently after 1989. And going back to China after COVID, I was struck, as I think others have been struck, at how a variety of social control mechanisms have accelerated, expanded in the years since 2012, since Xi Jinping came to power, at least to primary power in China. There's lots of different ways. Joan's gonna do something here on the screen.
Distracting, there's an arrow.
Thank you. There's lots of different ways of controlling society in China, and there always have been. There are personal ways of exercising social control in China. Anyone who goes back to China or has been in China since the late 80s, early 1990s is familiar with cameras that are everywhere and a variety of other ways that go back many, many decades of exercising social control over personal life. But there's two other aspects of social control that I also want to mention, and then I'll focus in on one of these three. The other two are social controls on institutions and organizations. That happens through political and regulatory means, and I'll talk about that primarily today. And then there are broad aspects of social control that don't just affect individuals, but affect the society as a whole. One could see the contagion controls during the COVID era from 2020 to about 2023 as forms of societal social control. The closing down of compounds, keeping people within their compounds, limiting travel within China, limiting travel within cities, taking people out of compounds if they had COVID, which sparked significant resistance in a variety of places in China. Those are broader societal social controls that have significant impacts on individuals and on organizations, but they're social controls that span the entire aspects of the entire range of Chinese society. So personal, institutional, societal, social controls in China. And I think most would agree that a variety of controls are expanding in the recent era in which we find ourselves in China. That's certainly my perspective, is that we see social control expanding in the personal realm, in the institutional realm, and in the broader societal realm in China. I'm going to focus primarily on the institutional realm today, because I work on institutions and I work primarily on what we would call, it's not called this in China, civil society institutions, foundations, charities, nonprofit organizations, associations, scholarly associations, groups like that. The wide range of organizations that make up a society's civil society sector. That's what I focus on in my work. And so really what I'm going to do today is illustrate some of the social controls on institutions in China with some specific focus on civil society, the nonprofit and philanthropic sector in China. Social control in China of the organizational or institutional kind takes place in the domestic context, and it takes place in the overseas or the international context. How does China control a range of these social organizations, foundations, charities, lots of nonprofits? There are hundreds of thousands of these organizations in China. One way of controlling them is by not allowing them. That's the North Korean approach. That is not the Chinese approach. China has recognized now for many decades that having some sort of controlled non-governmental sector is important for Chinese development. But for China, that's going to be balanced with a focus on security and a focus on social control. And so you see a variety of policymaking in China that emphasizes the need for a nonprofit sector, the need for a charitable sector, the need to harness private donations, the need to harness private action, but to keep it within some kind of bounds. And that bounds, that security focus, is the way social control plays out for nonprofits, foundations, and other civil society groups in China. There is a handout, so if anyone didn't get the handout, and I believe we are giving the handout out via the chat box or some other method for those who are watching online. So how is social control? Oh,
To send it.
okay. Haiyan is going to send out the handout via the chat box or some other method from here. and then I'll continue. The handout should be in the chat box now or somewhere like that. So how is social control organized over these hundreds of thousands of nonprofit type groups in China these days? As I said, one option is just to forbid this sector, but China has never wanted to do that. China's wanted to have a controlled civil society sector, one that contributes to the provision of social services while not engaging in rights-related advocacy work. What I call, sometimes when I give talks or write about this, what I call more third sector, that's social services, for the most part, less civil society, that's advocacy. How does China do that? China does that through political policy, and it does it through regulation. Political policy is pretty straightforward and covers most of Chinese society. This idea of national security, of enhancing security in the Xi Jinping era runs across virtually everything in China these days. With respect to the specifics of how this is worked out in the civil society sector, law, regulation plays a role here. And in this, as is often the case in China, we have nationwide laws, nationwide policy documents expressed through law, which control the sector. In China, that's called, at least one of the main pieces, is called the charity law, which was originally adopted in 2016 and has been recently amended and reissued at the end of 2023. I talk about that about halfway down through the handout because that's one of the means of exercising social control over the civil society sector, what I call the civil society sector, a term that's generally not used in China these days, except in private. Social control is exercised over the civil society sector through political policy, but also through this key regulatory document, the charity law, and a lot of other documents that go with it. This key regulatory document, the charity law, an omnibus document that covers a wide range of these civil society organizations, charities, nonprofits throughout China, covers a wide range of control mechanisms. It covers the registration and founding of organizations and which ones will be recognized by the Chinese state at various levels. It covers the role of the party as the primary political institution in China over all aspects of Chinese life, especially in the most recent decade to decade and a half, but including over the nonprofit sector. It provides pretty firm rules for how certain kinds of activities can be carried out that might prove troublesome. Among those are fundraising. There's lots of concerns with fundraising in China. Fundraising is needed for nonprofits, for charities, but there's lots of concerns about cheating and accountability and scandals and things like that. Crowdfunding over the web. Emergency donations to individuals, to communities. These are all areas in which there's been trouble in China and in which the authorities want to exercise some form of social control over what goes on. This is not complete control. If it were complete control, then fundraising would not be allowed. Crowdfunding would not be allowed. Emergency donations to individuals or to small communities would not be allowed. That's not what China's doing. China's trying to balance, with an emphasis on the security side, China's trying to balance security with the need for development and the need for a nonprofit sector to assist in that development. And that balancing, in recent years, has tilted toward the social control agenda, tilted toward the security agenda. So those are some aspects of how this is carried out on the domestic side. But social control also has an international element as well. Since the late 1970s, early 1980s, literally thousands of foreign nonprofit organizations, charitable organizations, non-governmental organizations, foundations, and other groups have come into China to work with their Chinese counterparts on development and social service and other issues in China for a long time. That influx of foreign nonprofit activity, foreign civil society activity was accepted, monitored, but not so strictly controlled in China. It did come under controls, but not the strictest controls. And so you had foreign nonprofits of various kinds, groups like Save the Children, groups like Oxfam, groups like the foundation I used to work at, the Ford Foundation, the Gates Foundation, and lots of others coming into China through various routes and working around China, being monitored, being looked at, it being clear that they could not engage in dissident activity in China, things like that, but with sometimes a relatively laissez-faire approach. That began to change about 10 years ago. And now an array of social control mechanisms are being used against these overseas groups as well. I say overseas because it includes not only foreign groups like American groups or British or German or Japanese, but also nonprofit groups that are coming in from Hong Kong and Taiwan. And we use the term overseas, Jingwai, and Chinese to apply to that full range of organizations. Those organizations now, since the regulatory document, the overseas NGO law that came into place when I was last here in Minnesota in 2016, is called the Overseas NGO Law of the People's Republic of China. And it significantly constrains the work of these overseas nonprofit civil society groups in China. It means that they can come into China and work usually only in two ways: through a representative office in Beijing or Shanghai or another part of China, a process which is long and increasingly difficult to negotiate, or through project activities, which are approved by the Chinese government. Those are really the only two channels these days for foreign nonprofit groups, philanthropies, and other types of organizations to come and work in China. Each such organization, whether they have a representative office in China or whether they are engaging in project activities, needs to have a Chinese partner which is responsible for their work in China. In addition to that, there is a second level of monitoring and social control over these groups, and that's called the Ministry of Public Security, which is China's main police security agency, which was given responsibility for monitoring and controlling the work of these overseas non-governmental organizations back in 2014, 2015. And they were told by the political authorities, the National Security Commission under the party, they were told, you are responsible for all of these foreign organizations. Make sure you know what they are all doing all the time, and make sure that we are constraining or not allowing activities which, in our view, would threaten the party or the state. And the Ministry of Public Security took up that task, adopted the law through the National People's Congress in 2016, the Overseas NGO law, and they are ultimately responsible for the work of all of these overseas groups. So it's a two-level system of social control. Each group has a partner for their activities or for their presence in China. And above that, beyond that, is the security apparatus, which is ultimately responsible for knowing what each group is doing in China. There's all kinds of issues in this system, but from the Chinese perspective, it has been a very successful system so far. This came into effect in 2017, and since 2017, through this process of requiring each foreign group to have a partnership arrangement with a Chinese organization, a approved Chinese organization, and overall reporting to the public security system, the public security system in China has gained control and knowledge over virtually every foreign nonprofit activity in China that's going on throughout the country down to the local level. It has been, in its own way, although very constraining for some of the organizations, it has been in its own way an impressive feat. From a system about 15 years ago in which the Chinese party and state could not say that they had full knowledge and control over what the international groups were doing in China. They would not have been able to say that. And they knew they couldn't say that. To a situation now in which, as a result of a political and regulatory shift, they know what's going on with virtually all the groups, is something that they set out to do and have done in their terms successfully. It's led to lots of constraints. It's led to lots of controls. If you're a foreign organization or a foreign foundation and you want to work on advocacy for rights in China, women's rights, human rights, other kinds of rights in China, you are significantly constrained these days in carrying out those activities. They're not on the list of approved activities for the most part. Some of that work continues in some other ways. It is possible for some disability groups to carry out some kinds of capacity building or other work on disability rights. There are some areas like environment where some work on rights may still be possible. But in general, we are seeing social control being exercised over that international overseas sector by constraining the areas in which they can work and constraining their operations in China through a system of significant regulation. It has meant for these overseas organizations that figuring out their relationships with their partners and figuring out what the security forces in China are not going to object to has become a primary element of everyday life in China. And in that, the usually Chinese representatives of these foreign representative offices in China have become key players. Most of the leaders of these offices in China for NGOs, nonprofits, foundations, most of the leaders in China are now Chinese representatives. They are the crucial middle people between the Chinese system, which seeks to know and control what's going on, and the foreign organizations which would like to continue working in China, even under the current constraints. Those Chinese representatives in Beijing, in Shanghai, who represent those organizations and deal with their partners and with the security system in China on a daily or weekly or monthly basis are the key people. And they play key roles. I've been privileged to know a number of them over the years, and I'm constantly in respect for their ability to balance the needs for knowledge and control on the part of the Chinese authorities, and at the same time, the programming interests of the foreign groups they represent, foundations, NGOs, and others. But they're the primary people in this, the Chinese usually head representatives of these organizations. So in China these days, this question of social control, which is pervasive across Chinese society, again, through personal aspects of social control, through organizational aspects of social control, and through what I call societal mechanisms, things that apply to everyone, institutional, personal, across the country, seeks to balance two different, sometimes contradictory, sometimes ambiguous dynamics in China. One is, and this is paramount since at least 2012, one is the desire for social control and national security. That's what you see when you go to China. I was at a university in Shanghai, this is about, what, 6 weeks ago? I was at a university in Shanghai. My group is happily discussing with our colleagues at that university the resumption of exchanges in an area, this is actually health and medicine, which is less controversial, and in which the Chinese authorities are willing to see a resumption of exchanges, and in some cases, projects. At the same time, when we go to lunch at a nearby hotel, Playing on the TV screen is the documentary from the Ministry of State Security about how to report the foreign spies in our midst. Those contradictions play out in China on a day-to-day basis. Colleagues in China, partners in China, wanting to get on again after COVID and in a period of significant social control, wanting to get back to some kind of exchanges and contact. At the same time, a focus on national security, a focus on social control that is pretty pervasive in China these days. Balancing that relationship between, as I put it on the handout, security and development, those tensions, is an issue in China today, and it's an issue that affects the Chinese representatives of overseas organizations on a day-to-day basis. Their job is to get things moving again after COVID. And at the same time, they work within a system in which the social control mechanisms and the national security attention is exceptionally strong. That's why I call it on the handout the complex role of the middle actors, the Chinese representatives and the Chinese partner organizations that are working with the foreign groups. Who maintains this system? It's the security forces, which are pretty pervasive in China, as I think all of you know, and the Chinese partner organizations with these foreign groups. They are also crucial middle actors, and they maintain the system. So that's some sense in the broad area of social control in China. What I've tried to do is sort of indicate how this plays out in the nonprofit sector, the philanthropic sector, both domestically and with the overseas organizations. It's not a situation in which social control mechanisms apply only to the domestic groups and don't apply to the foreign organizations. That is far from being the case. It's not a situation in which social control mechanisms apply only to the foreign groups, the overseas groups, and not to the domestic groups. Social control is pervasive in Chinese society today, and at least talking with Chinese colleagues and friends from afar during COVID and now going back to China, there is no sense that that emphasis on social control is going to let up in China anytime soon. So it's a process of negotiation. It's a process of figuring out for domestic nonprofit organizations, charities, including small groups at the local level, how to do what you want to do, how to do what's valuable for China in a context in which there is always constraint, there's always people watching one way or another, but at the same time, the Chinese party and Chinese state have recognized that it wants a functioning nonprofit sector. The Chinese development objectives, Chinese anti-poverty objectives cannot be reached without some sort of controlled nonprofit sector contributing to that development. So that's the balancing that takes place. How this will play out over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years is very hard to know. There were predictions a dozen years ago that we might see some relaxation at some point. So far, that has not happened in terms of social control mechanisms applied to this domestic and overseas nonprofit sector. Could things continue to get tighter, as they have been over the past decade or more? I think at least the Chinese scholars and partners and friends that I talked to, if they had to stake out a position just based on the last dozen years, I think they would say probably things are going to continue to get tighter rather than loosening. But China's always been very hard to predict. I also work on Vietnam, where some of the same types of controls are very much in effect. Controls on domestic organizations and controls on foreign organizations coming into Vietnam, international NGOs, foundations, and others. And in Vietnam, it's very early to tell, but we may now be seeing a sense that a fairly confident central leadership in Vietnam may be willing to relax some of those controls a bit, a little bit. It's not clear yet, but there are signals in terms of the releases of some prisoners, in terms of some legislative development, regulatory development, that we might be seeing a pretty centralized, authoritarian, Leninist government, not unlike the Chinese situation, willing to undertake bits and pieces of relaxation. We could be wrong about that. If I came back next year, I might describe the Vietnamese situation as having reverted to an authoritarian, very control-oriented norm. But there is some hope in the Vietnamese context that once, from their perspective, enough control has been established, it may be possible to relax some controls on the nonprofit or civil society sector. Would that happen in China? I tend personally not to be optimistic about that myself. And many Chinese colleagues are not optimistic for relaxation in the Chinese context. But you never know, which is one of the things that makes China fascinating for all of us. And with that, I'm going to stop and take any questions you would like. Thank you. I see questions in the Q&A box, so I'm going to open the Q&A box.
Okay. You have a question on the floor here.
On the floor first, yes.
Yes, sorry.
If I may, to pick up where you just left off, what is the motivation or the incentive for the relaxation of any such social controls? Why would they relax social controls?
So there are some signals that maybe there's going to be some relaxation. Part of this, frankly, has to do with the fact that US-Vietnam relations look very different than US-China relations. And some of the impetus toward relaxation in Vietnam, to some degree, comes from pressure applied from the United States and other parts of the world. And China is just not subject to the same kinds of pressures. Vietnam is a much smaller, I mean, you all know this, much smaller place that needs to balance its relationships with China and with the United States and with other countries. So some of it's that. But some of it could be, if this happens, which is as yet unclear, some of this could be a sense that the centralization of social control in Vietnam has gone too far. And it's beginning to affect domestic donations and beginning to affect the work of domestic Vietnamese social organizations and charitable groups that the government wants active in controlled ways, but that are not able to be active, in some cases have closed down over the past 5 or 10 years. So there is maybe some sense in Vietnam, then I'll come back to the China side, maybe some sense in Vietnam that the controls maybe went a little too far and that they need to pare back a bit. Now, again, looking at this a year from now, one might say that the early signals of maybe some relaxation were not borne out. But we could also maybe say in Vietnam a year from now, Vietnam is perhaps on a slightly different path from China with respect to these social control issues as carried out with respect to nonprofits. In China, we don't see these signals, at least at this point. In China, the social control aspects have been paramount, balanced with the need for development, the need for public donations, the need for charitable organizations to do work at the local level. China recognizes that, but we're not seeing these signs, at least from what I can tell, we're not seeing these signs of relaxation in China.
Thank you.
Other questions? Does the ever-increasing global temperatures and implications, I don't know if people online can see this, and certainly people in the room, well, actually can see it. Does the ever-increasing global temperatures and implications for ever-decreasing agricultural production ever get overtly acknowledged in any of the social control mechanisms? I think yes, in a variety of ways. sometimes in negative ways. We have seen both in China and in Vietnam climate change groups, in some cases working on advocacy activities, coming under pressure, sometimes very significant pressure from the authorities. At the same time, we have seen, I'm thinking particularly about China now, of smaller agricultural production, agricultural assistance groups, citizens groups, nonprofit charitable groups, including some overseas groups, working in China. And because of agricultural production and other rural issues in China, those groups where their activities are not perceived to threaten the party and state have been allowed to continue their activities. So in a sense, the question raises the sort of same contradictory dynamic that I was talking about before. Groups, for example, in Vietnam over the past 3 to 5 years, groups that very assertively push a climate change agenda and policy change, including criticizing central policies in Vietnam, have at times been closed down and their leaders detained for working on climate change and environmental work. This is not political dissidence of the traditional type. But at the same time, other groups and the issues you raise, agricultural and others, that have been seen as contributory to social services, to increasing production, have been allowed to continue. How are China's uses of social controls any different from what is happening in the United States and other Western nations? We have aspects of social control with respect to the nonprofit sector in the United States, Western Europe, and other countries as well. If I were comparing, and in my work, I tend to compare more like countries to more like countries. So I tend to write about places like China and Vietnam rather than directly comparing China and the US. But if you were comparing China and the US, I think we would see an atmosphere in which a variety of advocacy activities are more possible in the US than they are in more authoritarian places like China and Vietnam, speaking generally. Who knows what that situation could look like in a year, either in China or in the US. We have no idea. But in general, we have social control mechanisms in our country, in the US, and in other countries around the world as well. But I think most observers, if we're going to compare non-like situations, a non-like situation is China and the US. We're going to compare non-like situations. The social controls look stronger in a place like China, especially in the most recent decade and before, than they would in the US. Are grassroots NGOs still able to survive in the current social controls? The answer is, to some degree, yes. And this is a China-focused question, so I'm going to answer it specifically for China, where we just have more information. Some grassroots NGOs that work on social services, that work on providing charitable services to local citizens, that are not perceived to threaten the party and state, have been able to survive and continue their work in China. I was just hearing about a group this morning here in Minneapolis at breakfast with some friends this morning, hearing about a grassroots, I won't even call it a group, I'll call it an initiative that was able to get started during the most recent era in China and spread around China with acceptance by the authorities, something that was considered I'd probably call it a safety a set of issues involving environment, involving conservation, begun by a series of people and is now active in a number of localities around China. It's not perceived to threaten the party or state. It's not perceived as political. It's perceived as an intervention that helps with safety and helps with policy development. And at least so far, it has not run afoul of the authorities. In effect, the development side for that is considered more applicable than the social control or security side. And I think many things in China, as in Vietnam, but in China, many things can be viewed through that prism of security and development. And some things fit more neatly onto the development side, and they continue to be allowed. So the answer, grassroots NGOs still allowed, the answer is a yes, assuming that they can fit onto the development side, onto the social services side, rather than being perceived as advocacy or political. I'll see what else is there. Very good, very good.
Questions here.
I am not a China expert. I'm not an NGO expert. I'm just curious, do you have any case studies of a particular organization that has been able to make it versus one that has not? And where did it change? Do the negotiations with the government take place when the organization knocks on their door? Or do you get your foot in and then you have to play this game, so to speak? It sounds like you have to, be very, very careful all the way down the road in order to actually be effective, eventually be effective. So do you have an example? I'm an NGO, I want to go in, I want to do work in a particular area. What advice, how would you walk me through this?
Yeah, we have examples of both kinds. We have examples of a number of organizations that were active in China before this most recent policy document, the Overseas NGO Law, came into effect in 2017, and have been able to stay in China. They initially, in some cases, carried out work that was considerably broader than what they can do now. And they adapted to the situation. They read the documentation carefully. They talked with their partners. If they were doing rights and advocacy work, they figured out how to do that in a different way, or they stopped doing that and moved to other kinds of work, more technical, capacity building work, other kinds of projects. They adapted to the changing dynamics of social control in China. We also have groups in that 2016, 2017 time that were active in China, that were working on advocacy related issues, and decided that given what they did, they would probably not feel comfortable working in China anymore. And most of those organizations left China. They either left for Hong Kong or Seoul or Bangkok so they could work more broadly in Asia, or they sort of departed the East Asian scene altogether. If you're a new organization seeking to work in China, or an organization that used to work in China and is now trying to come back, then it's a question of generally establishing or reestablishing ties with partners in China, professional partner organizations in China, government agency, or an approved charitable group, and figuring out with them what is acceptable in the current context. That's figuring out what's acceptable is not necessarily that hard. China, as compared to some other countries, China's very clear about what's acceptable. What I call the programming feasibility box. That box is pretty clear in China. You can work on this, you may not work on that. And Chinese organizations are pretty clear about what they can say with their foreign counterparts. Can I do rights advocacy at the village or county level in China directly as a foreign organization? That's going to be a no. Can I do capacity building on international standards for disability rights through universities in China? The answer to that could be yes. Chinese partners are pretty clear about that. And so organizations that are coming into China now, if they're working with partners and if they've developed some level of being able to have conversations, even trust with Chinese partners, are able to figure out what's within that programming feasibility box and what's outside it. Having said that, if what you want to do is establish a representative office in China these days, 6 or 7 years after the overseas NGO law came into effect, that has generally gotten harder. China wanted to register a number of the existing groups in 2016, 2017, 2018, especially 2017, 2018. They wanted to keep many of those groups in China as long as they were willing to work within the constrained areas available. Most of those groups stayed, a number of those groups left. New groups coming in, even while they may have carefully worked out what they can do in China that's acceptable, are having some difficulties getting their registrations. It's a pretty constrained time in China these days. And groups that are applying for those licenses, which means having an office, Beijing, Shanghai, or another place, generally having Chinese staff, are finding that that's taking longer or that those offices are not coming into being. Projects, individual projects, generally one-year projects, renewable projects with Chinese partners that do not involve a permanent office or semi-permanent office in China, those project arrangements are more available. They're generally smaller. They're generally with one institution rather than a number of institutions across the country. They're approved individually by the Chinese authorities, and they are sometimes a way for organizations that have not been active in China or have not been active in China recently to sort of get a programming foothold in the country while they figure out what they might be able to do in China, and while the Chinese authorities figure out if they want them more permanently in China. So projects tend to be smaller, they tend to be 1 year, although many of them turn out to be 2 or 3 year projects, and they're sort of a way for everyone to get used to each other and to figure out if they want a sort of longer engagement in China. I didn't put the numbers on the handout, but there's about 6,000 of those since 2017. In terms of representative offices of foreign NGOs, foreign foundations, foreign business associations established as nonprofits and other groups like that, there's about 600 of those since 2017. So it's a much smaller number. And it represents a much more significant commitment by the foreign organization. It means having a physical office for the most part. It means having Chinese staff. It means having a series of programs in China that roll over from year to year rather than something that's just 1 year. It's a commitment to China that some organizations are willing to make at some point, and some organizations are not. Thankfully, most of the foreign foundations that were active in China before have chosen to remain active in China either through offices in Beijing or other parts of China, or through these 1 year project activities, grants into China, things like that, that may become 2 or 3 years and may be continued with other grants. Most of the foreign foundations have been active. One foreign foundation that really focused on rights was not in China before the overseas NGO law came into effect and has not returned to China. But they weren't active in China before that as well. They really focused on rights, they really focused on advocacy, and to my knowledge, they never significantly considered trying to return to China, knowing that they were unwelcome before the Xi Jinping era and would remain unwelcome in the Xi Jinping era, which I think is correct. I think they were unwelcome and they would have stayed unwelcome. But most of the other grant-making institutions have stayed active in China, generally through offices. Sometimes they are able to conduct more constrained activities than they could have conducted before. If one is familiar with the activities of some of the foreign foundations in China, at a more open time in China, they could do a wider range of activities. Now, those activities are constrained by that, what I call the programming feasibility box. Yeah.
If you are a Chinese citizen and you decide that you would like to work for one of these NGOs, are you more suspect by the Chinese government? Is there an issue there at all? Or do you know?
There has sometimes been that issue. But Chinese citizens who serve as the representatives or on the staff of the approved foreign organizations, overseas organizations, including Hong Kong and Taiwan, that work in China, if those organizations are approved, they have office licenses, or they're carrying out these project activities, which we call temporary activities, serving as the staff for them is generally acceptable these days. And in some cases, it's not just acceptable, it's really important. Because they really, the Chinese staff, especially the leading Chinese staff, they're the ones who are really the key translators between the Chinese authorities who are concerned about social control and security and the overseas groups that want to do their work in China. Social enterprise work, disability work, environmental work. Sometimes talking with the Chinese counterpart organizations is still complicated and is always more complicated when you're not traveling to China. And for a period of about 4 years, virtually none of these organizations were traveling to China. So these people in the middle have been very important. It's not to say that people never get into trouble. People have gotten into trouble at times. But if your organization is legally able to be in China and is not under enormous day-to-day scrutiny from the authorities as a group that might get kicked out, it doesn't happen very often, then serving as a Chinese staff member is generally an acceptable thing to do and actually can be really important because they're the ones who are maintaining the relationship. Without those senior Chinese staff, I would say all Chinese staff, but it's the senior Chinese staff. Without them sort of serving as the interlocutors between the professional partners and the security forces on the one side and the home offices of these international NGOs or other groups on the other side, much of this would not be possible. Yeah, in the far back first, yeah.
I have a question about Hong Kong.
Yeah.
So if the Guoan file about national security that infected in Hong Kong, do you think, or what's your perspective or foresee about the trends about NPO or domestic, in terms of domestic NPO or the international foreign companies will be developed in Hong Kong?
Yeah. We have seen a gradual tightening over both domestic civil society groups in Hong Kong and the international nonprofits, foundations, and others that either were in Hong Kong before or that set up in Hong Kong when things became more complicated in China as a way of working in China. So there's been tightening across the board, but especially for domestic Hong Kong organizations. The national security law, as you indicate, at least in part, has been aimed at the civil society community in Hong Kong. And life for the civil society community in Hong Kong has often gotten more difficult. Now, if you're just focused on the provision of social services, the example I generally give is school lunches for kids. Perhaps preferably where you are providing the funds into a school system and the school system is providing those school lunches. You're not doing it yourself. That's still perfectly acceptable in Hong Kong. Basic social service related work is still okay. Where it veers into advocacy, where it veers into politics, as you know, as everyone here knows, under the national security law in Hong Kong, that has become more complicated. One of the things that has become more complicated is that for about 4 or 5 years, there were some overseas international NGOs that had bases, offices in Hong Kong, and were using those offices to do capacity building or other work, partnership work in China. That was a sort of channel that was generally acceptable. That's become more complicated as well. As things have become more integrated between Hong Kong and the mainland, increasingly, it's more difficult for that bridge in Hong Kong. It's not impossible, there remain foreign organizations from outside Hong Kong that have bases, approved offices in Hong Kong, and use that to carry out activities in China that are acceptable on both sides of that now permeable border. But it's more complicated than it used to be. And certainly some of the advocacy groups that were trying to do work in China from a base in Hong Kong 10 years ago, 8 years ago, even 6 years ago, they have come under pressure in Hong Kong. And there are groups, either Hong Kong indigenous advocacy groups or foreign groups that moved out of China into Hong Kong, hoping to continue work in China. That's become more complicated. The national security law, as I think everyone knows, has had a significant effect on civil society in Hong Kong. Yeah.
I don't want to take anybody else's question, but this is a bit naive to ask. I hope you'll forgive me for that. But are there non-regulatory social control at work in China? For example, you might call them voluntary. The way people, the values that people grow up with, based in their religion or their view of the world, their philosophies. Is there such a thing as voluntary social control in a sense?
I think there is. It's a really, it's a very significant and very complex topic. And I'll just answer it, in the sort of limited personal way. If I talk to Chinese friends or talk to Chinese colleagues about the range of controls on civil society organizations in China, sometimes I'm talking to old friends, old colleagues, who see no significant problems with those controls. And for them, this is reflective of aspects of Chinese life and Chinese culture. They generally don't put it in terms of religion. They put it in terms of culture more generally, history more generally. It reflects among some in China, not everyone, but it reflects sometimes an acceptance of the more controlled regime of the past 10, 12 years because of a sense that some people agree with the party and government about the need for social stability and view that as having, in some cases, some cultural roots in China. There's others who know much more about that side of things than I do. But that view is there. And I'll talk to either older people or some younger people who don't view a system of controls and stability, social stability, as being a kind of external construct imposed, which it is, imposed by the party and government, but view it as something that is indigenous to Chinese culture, at least to some degree. And has led some people in China, since we don't have good polling, not sure we have good polling here either, but since we don't have good polling in China, we don't know how many, but there is a certain range of the Chinese population that does not oppose some of this. May have opposed some aspects of contagion controls under COVID, when things were regarded, I think, pretty widely as having gone too far. But may not oppose some aspects of broader social controls in the idea of preserving social stability. You'll hear that perspective. Absolutely. Yeah.
It's fair.
Yeah.
Add on. What about women's rights? You said that was a no-no.
Yeah, it's
Is China changing in that regard?
women's rights have come under significant pressure in China over the past 10, 15 years and perhaps longer. A number of women's rights groups have been dismantled or told to go out of existence. The individuals remain. And in some cases, individuals who work on women's rights in China are waiting for better days to return. But a number of organizations have been forced out of existence or forced into sort of not being active Most of the foreign organizations that worked on women's rights, foundations and others, have been in effect told or figured out for themselves that working directly on advocacy for women's rights in China in this era was not something that was going to get approved. But in some cases, they have been able to sort of morph some of their programs into capacity building programs or other programs that don't focus as much on rights and advocacy and are more focused on capacity building, training, things like that, or at least look like they're more focused on that, and are generally carried out with more acceptable organizations. Universities, government agencies, big charity groups, rather than smaller rights-oriented activist groups. That's pretty much unacceptable these days to the authorities. So in that sense, it's a complicated picture, but the overall pattern has been toward much less sympathy for women's rights activities in China. Having said that, there's a number of the overseas organizations that worked with these smaller groups for many years. They know that people are still there. They know that there's people in China who carried out rights and advocacy work in a variety of fields, not just women's rights, a variety of fields, and who are waiting for better days. They may not be optimistic that those better days are going to come anytime soon, but they're hoping that they do. And it's not just that field, it's a variety. Staying in touch with each other, not in an organizational way, more in a social way, because people do have to be careful in China these days. There's no doubt about that.
Okay, we've come to time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sidel. Everybody hear me?
Well, my pleasure. Thanks to the people online too.
Yes, thank you, everyone online. I appreciate all of you joining us both online and in person. I hope to see you at our 45th anniversary on November 20th. We will be hosting the Bob and Kim Griffin Building U.S.-China Bridges annual lecture, and our featured speaker is Professor Yasheng Huang, who is from MIT. So look for those announcements, and it's on our website, and we hope to see you then. Have a really lovely afternoon, and again, thanks everybody for joining us today.
Thank you all.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.